All right, welcome to this invited panel on the topic of Towards a Systems Engineering Foundation. My name is Ricardo Valerdi. I'm from the University of Arizona, and I have three distinguished panelists. The first person to your right, Olivia DeWeck from MIT. To your right, Gary Smith from Airbus, and finally, Lydia Kaiser from the Technical University of Berlin. What I've asked each panelist to do is give some opening remarks on their thoughts on the foundations of systems engineering, which I think will be extremely insightful and get the conversation going. So they'll each have an opportunity to give some remarks, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. There are two microphones in the center aisle, and then we'll be monitoring with the help of JB. We'll be monitoring any questions from our remote participants. So I encourage you to think of lots of questions, and we're going to have plenty of time. They're only going to speak for 20 minutes each, which gives us plenty of time for Q&A in the second half of the panel. So I'll introduce the first panelist and give him an opportunity to give his remarks, and then I'll do the other introductions later. But I'll start with Ollie DeWeck, who's the Apollo Program Professor of Astronautics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he is the Director of the Engineering Systems Laboratory. And his research in systems engineering focuses on how complex technological systems are designed and how they evolve over time. He is a fellow of INCOSE and AIAA and serves as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Spacecraft and Rockets. Professor DeWeck, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for attending this panel, and thank you for Ricardo for leading it. You know, we are in search of the foundations of our discipline in system engineering, and the remarks that I'll be making are closely matched to what I said at the IW, which we had in Torrance, California in January. And so some of this, if you were there, some of this might be a repetition, but I really want to reinforce the message. And I think in Raul Basol's keynote this morning, he talked about how complexity is increasing, and data and visualizations help us you know, understand and grasp that complexity. So one of the things I really believe is that system engineering is a cognitive discipline. It's essentially about understanding components, interactions, functions, interfaces, and shaping all those components, interfaces, and behaviors in a way that delivers value and minimizes the downsides of those systems. And in order to really do that well, we need to start budgeting and actively managing the complexity of the systems that we build, that we maintain, that we retire as well. And that's maybe an area where there's a vast literature, but where the foundations of complexity quantification and management still need, I think, quite a bit of work, particularly experimentation. So to remind ourselves, the idea of complexity is a multi-dimensional one. And it should start with the users or customers of the systems that we build here in the upper left. And it also is influenced by competitors. You know, many industries are highly competitive, whether you're looking at the automotive industry, pharmaceutical, medical devices, in the energy industry. Usually organizations are not operating in a vacuum, but they're subject to competition, which is a good thing. So translating needs to requirements. We heard about the requirements working group, the really excellent work INCOSE has been doing on requirements. Requirements are the things that drive functional complexity. So what are the things that our systems, the functions they perform, and at what level of performance as well. So functional complexity is driven through the requirements. And then in order to enable those functions, of course, we do design. We perform design, we decompose our systems, and we end up with what we can see, the structural complexity of our systems, whether it's hardware, software, humans in the loop. Structural complexity is typically the type of complexity that we understand the best. That's the easiest to see, to visualize, to quantify and manage. So I'm going to focus quite a bit on structural complexity. Well, I think one of the unsolved problems, one of the real foundational problems in system engineering is, given a set of requirements or functional complexity, what is the minimum structural complexity, the essential, the simplest structural solution to deliver the functions we want? Can we rigorously find the essential complexity? I don't think we know yet how to find the essential complexity for most real world problems. So we typically build in excess complexity that doesn't have value and maybe also causes failure modes in our systems. And you see this dashed arrow going back to functional complexity. It means that there's a feedback loop between functional and structural complexity, especially suppressing undesired behaviors leads to additional structural complexity that we might not need had we found a simpler solution. And finally, we heard, I think, about Conway's law already, which many of you know very well. It's basically a homomorphic concept where the organization that develops a system and the system itself that results from the efforts of the organization are very closely matched and closely mapped in terms of their complexity, their modularization, and that's where the human aspect comes in. And finally, of course, we care about effort, non-recurring engineering effort, the schedule, the measurable outcomes of a program development effort. So all those dimensions are coupled. And if we think about the typology of complexity for engineered systems, we have the system itself, so that's shown in blue here. The engineered system has both structural and functional complexity. And structural complexity is quantifiable through its components, its interfaces. And the third element is really important. It's very exciting. I think it's very important, is the topological complexity. So a measure of complexity that only counts components and interfaces is incomplete because it doesn't account for topological complexity. Functional complexity includes the interaction structure as well as the interaction uncertainty, since many systems behave stochastically and not just deterministically. And then finally, the organizational complexity is heavily influenced by human cognition, the way we perceive the actual complexity and how we deal with it. So how do we rigorously quantify complexity and structural complexity in particular? There are thousands of papers on it. There are a lot of complexity indices that have been proposed. But in order for a complexity index to be valid, it needs to pass certain tests. And I'm not going to go through these tests here, but Elaine Weicker, some of you might know her name. She's an IEEE fellow. She's done a lot of work on software complexity. And she came up with a list of about 8 criteria, which we call the Weickers criteria. So for example, if you relabel the components, it shouldn't change the complexity. If you show the same system at a higher level of abstraction, the actual complexity of the system shouldn't change. It's just the representation that changes. And so one of the complexity measures that actually comes from a field called quantum chemistry is one that we've been very excited about, and we believe that it applies to more macroscopic systems. So what you see in the upper left is a chemical molecule. It's a hydrocarbon molecule. It has 2 benzene rings. You have your carbon atoms, your hydrogen atoms. And how complex is this particular molecule compared to, for example, EPO, which is what helps us produce red blood cells? Well, it's a lot simpler. And the complexity measure here is based on what's known as the Hamiltonian. So the Hamiltonian captures the total energy in the system, both the potential and kinetic energy, and it's decomposable in these 2 matrices, I and A. I is a diagonal matrix, and it basically captures the complexity of the individual atoms i.e. components. And then the beta is the strength of the bonds between the atoms. There are four kinds of bonds typically in chemistry, and so there are different strength of bonds. But particularly the A matrix, which is also known as the adjacency matrix of the graph, has energy, and it's known as graph energy. So if we generalize that, we arrive at an expression C equals C1 plus C2 times C3, C1 being the complexity that resides in the individual components when they're all disconnected from each other. C2 is the energy or the complexity that is in the interfaces, the bilateral interfaces. And then C3, to me, the most interesting of those terms is the topological complexity contribution. And what we found by looking at many different systems is that C3, the C3 term, helps us understand the nature of the system that we're dealing with. So at the bottom here, we have centralized architectures. So those are architectures where we have one hub, maybe a couple hubs, and most of the components are connected into the hub. That's a centralized architecture. And you know that if the C3 term is less than one. Most real-world systems have some kind of hierarchical architecture with multiple hubs, and the C3 term will be between 1 and 2. And then a lot of recent systems, network systems, are distributed systems with simpler components, but complex mesh-like topology. The C3 term will be greater than 2. And so the interesting question is, if you're an organization thinking about developing systems, where's your strength? Are you good at developing centralized architectures, hierarchical architectures, or distributed architectures? And the implications are quite profound. So how am I doing time on this? Good. So let's look at a real example of important systems. Unless you were born here in Honolulu, I'm assuming everybody flew here, yes? Or came by ship, but probably you flew here. And that means you were the beneficiaries of these machines, the geared or the turbofan engines. I'm showing you here one engine that in particular we've worked on and know very well, which is the GTF, the geared turbofan engine, which is the PW1500 Pratt & Whitney engine that's, for example, used on the A320neo. And you look at the cross section of this engine, and at first sight, there's nothing particularly new here, but in fact there is. So this is a 2-spool direct drive engine. Most of the air goes around the core, so it's bypass flow. But I want to point your attention to this gearbox, which you see here on the left side. This is a planetary gear, so all the power of the engine that drives the fan goes through that gearbox, allows to decouple the fan from the low pressure spool at a fixed ratio of about 3:1. This gearbox, this fan drive gear system, leads to 15% less fuel consumption and 70% less noise, because you can run the fan slower and you can run the low pressure spool faster. And it's been a real revolution in the engine industry. But that's the current state of the art. So if you look back at the history of air-breathing engines, jet engines, we go back to World War II, the Whittle engine from the UK. Germany was also very active, of course, in the engine business early on. And those engines were very simple turbojets. So if you see the upper left here, we have up here, Architecture 71. This is from a doctoral thesis at MIT. Narek Shugarian, who's now at the Jet Propulsion Lab, basically was able to generate all architectures that we've ever created for air-breathing engines using a compositional approach. So very simple engine, all the air goes through the core. We have a single stage. It's very simple, so the complexity is low, but the performance in terms of fuel burn is poor, very inefficient. TSFC stands for thrust-specific fuel consumption. So how much fuel do you burn per unit of thrust, per Newton of thrust per second? Then, we went to multi-stage engines. We started creating the turbofans. We created the bypass flows. So the turbofan is architecture 70. You see a very large improvement in performance, for some increase in complexity. The point is the curve gets very shallow. So the gear turbofan I just showed you normalized is a 1-1. And the question is, where do we go from here? So one of the ways we can go, and there are demonstrator aircraft, is to distribute essentially the power. To still have a single turbine, but then you distribute the power either electrically or mechanically to multiple smaller fans, potentially along the leading edge of the airplane. So we go to distributed systems. Remember the C3 term, those distributed systems. But the complexity of that system, managing all those propulsors, transmitting the power either electrically or mechanically, it's going to be a lot more complex. And you can see that we're now operating in this zone here, which is much higher complexity. And because this is mature technology, each percent improvement is much harder to get in terms of the price we pay due to complexity. Perhaps the most interesting finding from this work was this engine here is actually a Russian engine that was developed, at the very end of the Soviet Union, after the Soviet Union had collapsed. But it's called the Kuznetsov NK9394. And this engine has been proven to be the most efficient engine ever built in terms of its fuel consumption, TSFC, again, kilograms per Newton per second. So you can see it's a real outlier here. However, this engine was never certified for commercial operations. It is really incredibly complex. It has 2 counter-rotating variable pitch fans. It has not just one gearbox, but 2 counter-rotating gearboxes. And it's a 3-spool engine, so similar to the Rolls-Royce architecture, which uses 3 spools. So yes, great performance, great efficiency, but incredibly complex and potentially with many failure modes that essentially prevented this engine from ever being certified. So the question is, can our systems be too complex? And I'll finish up with some ongoing work on relating complexity versus effort. Because if increasing complexity of our systems further and further requires more effort, which we know it does, the question is, well, how does this effort that we need to spend, the system engineering effort, scale? We know now from many different experiments, papers, empirical evidence in industry, that the effort, system engineering effort, increases superlinearly with complexity, however you measure complexity. The upper right here, thank you, Ricardo. The upper right shows you some fairly recent results from an experiment that we did with individuals solving a kind of network problem, more like a traveling salesman kind of problem of increasing complexity. And what we did is we compared the performance of the human solution against an optimized computer-generated solution. We also captured the amount of time that individuals spent to solve the problem as complexity increased from left to right. The interesting part of this is really all in the exponent. If the effort to solve a problem scales with complexity, so some factor A times the complexity of the system, the exponent is B plus D is a kind of bias or offset term. The interesting question is, how does it scale? And the work we've done so far on controlled experiments shows that the exponent is very close to 1.5 or 3/2. So in Sinha's work, 1.48, Hopker's work, 1.558. And yes, the data is noisy, but the findings are very consistent. So I had some discussions with Ricardo about Cosismo, and I'll show you a chart on the next chart. Cosismo also predicts a nonlinearity, but it's much milder. It's 1.06 only. So it is superlinear, but much less than 1.5. Why is that? And then finally, Those of you that were at the IW in January, you know that we conducted a whole bunch of experiments. I'm sorry to tell you that I don't yet have a lot of results to show. We're still doing the data analysis, but our expectation is that the exponent will be also superlinear and close to 1.5. But we don't know that yet for sure. And we're going to try to have this ready to present at the IW in 2024. So why, I'm going to finish with this thought here. You might think, oh, well, this is nice and theoretical and academic, you know, is the exponent 1.1? Is it 1.5? Who cares? Well, here's recent news from July 13th, the Mars Sample Return Mission. Many of you have heard about it. It's a NASA mission. It's led by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and that mission is currently on the hot seat in the U.S. Senate because the estimates for the total cost of the NASA Mars Sample Return Mission have just ballooned to about $9 billion. Already 1.7 billion has been spent on that mission, and the projections were about 4 to 5 billion, and the budget has just more or less doubled. Why is that? In part because the mission had to be re-architected, and there's actually a link with the Ukraine war, believe it or not, because of Europeans not being able to deliver the Fetch rover because of, you know, the issues we have with Russia. The architecture for Mars Sample Return was modified. It now is going to carry 2 helicopters. It's going to have a different mechanism to launch, you know, the return capsule and so forth. So the requirements have changed, the architecture has changed, and the cost of that mission might double to $9 billion because of this increasing complexity. And I think it's not clear what will happen, what will be decided by Congress, but I think it's a real world manifestation of this nonlinearity between system complexity and effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Ollie, for staying on budget and on schedule. Yeah, right on the money. So our next panelist is Gary Smith. He's a senior expert systems engineer at Airbus Defense and Space. He is the overall architect for engineering processes and provides technical leadership in the digital transformation of the division. He is an INCOSE expert systems engineering professional and the senior editor of the Systems Foundation section of the CBOC. He's involved with the International Federation for Systems Research and is starting a term as president of the International Society for Systems Sciences. I'll also mention that he has a strategic t-shirt selection that hopefully he'll tell us about. And Gary also recently celebrated a birthday here in Hawaii.
Hi. No, I never expected I'd be standing here 10 years ago. No, that's actually where I started this journey. This is a topic that's been capturing my attention for quite some time. I guess the overall theme of what I'm going to be explaining to you is that the scientific foundations for systems engineering already exists, but they're not organized, and they're not made explicit, and they're actually not connected to the stuff that we do. So when we look at the ancestors and the heritage of system science, there's this great paper by Andreas, which lays it out really well. I'd also like to bring to your attention 3 people who are not mentioned on here. Bogdanov, back in 1917, he published something called Techtology, which was about the science of organizations. Absolutely amazing stuff. I also came across Tom Stonier recently. He's an information scientist, and he basically explains that information is as much a reality of the universe as energy and mass. His stuff is absolutely incredible. And I'd also like to pay recognition to Bud Lawson, who also was very influential on me and my thinking. I'd also like to draw out these photos of people. I won't go through who they are, but all of these people have made significant contributions to my thought and this overall framework. for organizing our knowledge. Some of those people you might recognize who have participated in the System Science Working Group and INCOSE. This is a photo of our last IW prior to COVID, and these were all the people from the System Science, the ISSS, who were participating in the System Science Working Group. Amazing people, really amazing people. And this was a photo at our last ISSS conference, again before the pandemic. And you know, the person who's sitting front and center here is Len Troncali, who's been doing systems research for probably about 60 years. An amazing guy. Okay, so how do we organize our knowledge about systems? And this is, I'm going to tell you some of the things that the founder said about general systems theory and its applicability in terms of the nature of systems. So we've got Bertalanffy principles that are applicable to all systems, whatever their nature may be. Wiener, science that is applicable equally to physical, biological, social, and psychological phenomena. Common patterns, laws and principles from Boulding. Rappaport, interconnectedness, interdependence, interrelationships of components, feedback loops, dynamic nature of systems. Identifying common principles, James Miller. So more on Bertalanffy, Wiener again. And I mentioned Len's work. Len was working with all of these guys, and he's still, even now in his 80s, still pretty active. This was something he published in the 1970s, which was about nature's enduring patterns. Then we've got, so that's one dimension of system science, knowledge about systems. And now we also have another dimension of knowledge about how we can be systemic. And again, this is some of the things that the founders said. Bertalanffy, the understanding of social systems, organizations, and human behavior can be greatly enhanced by applying general systems theory. Boulding, viewing organizations as complex systems with interconnected components and interdependent relationships. All of this stuff was being talked about in the 60s. Peter Senge, Meadows, Ackoff, Stafford Beer. And when I was trying to think of something which would kind of summarize all of this up, there's this great book from a group in Finland, Being Better, Better, which is about systems intelligence. This is, again, really good stuff. It's very easy to read. It's full of lots of wisdom. So organizing stuff. Frameworks are required for integration. And there's no better example than this, than the periodic table. The periodic table was what enabled us to move from alchemy to sort stuff out and to move to chemistry. And when you look at the root terms, mystery is the basis of alchemy, mastery is the basis of chemistry. And I think that we're on the cusp of moving from alsystemy to systemry. Because without system science, we will remain alsystemists. We've got a massive, diverse wealth of knowledge in all of these different fields and domains and disciplines, including systems engineering. But unless we get our act together and organize all of our stuff, it's all still going to remain heuristics. It's all going to be based on experience and not connected to the actual science. So the vision is that systems engineers of the future would apply their understanding of systemics when they manipulate and transform systems. With a framework based on general systems theories, we have the ability to comprehend and organize the general human activity system, and I'll talk about that in a little while. It has to be validated by diverse and numerous heuristic models that instantiate it. It will integrate all knowledge in a systemic way. It will systematically define, develop, and connect core system concepts. It will provide the foundations for the architecture of our systems engineering knowledge. And using that, we will, I think, enhance our structure and our understanding and our interconnectedness of ISO 15288, the handbook, the SE book, and enhance it as a genuine system to resolve those inconsistencies, duplications, and gaps that we know do exist. And this will lead to the recognition of systems engineering as a discipline with the same degree of authority as the other applied sciences. So when we look at science as a knowledge management system, there are these key phases that are involved. So we have ideas, theoretical frameworks, principles, assets, and nature and society. I gave a keynote at the ISSS just about a month ago. I had an hour, and I'm going to show you some of the core stuff from that, but it's not going to be gentle. I'm warning you, because I'm just going to be basically showing you what it is. I'm not going to go through why it is, how it is, because there's just not enough time. But when we look at ideas, an idea, a concept is a holon. The holon is utilized in a theoretical framework with a number of other concepts. So we now have relational theory. Relational theory is a model which brings together concepts, and relational theory is essentially a universal model of the system's experience, which is applicable to every single kind of system, and everything in the universe is both a system and also a part of something greater, and that's holarchy. That's another key aspect. So from our theoretical frameworks, we can derive principles. When we apply those principles, we create assets, and those assets then have an engagement in nature and society. And there are forward and backward paths in this development and application of knowledge. So we go from holon as a concept to relational theory as a model. From that, we can then start to drive principles like everything follows a life cycle. We utilize that principle in our life cycle management processes, and in sort of like common wisdom, general knowledge, we know that it's simply the way of things. Things come into existence, they have a life, and they die. But we can use that as the basis for basically managing our stuff. So there are two knowledge frameworks, and they both overlay. They're both holarchic and also they're relational. They're based on the relational model. So there's knowledge about systems, and there's two dimensions to that. There's the more objective and the more subjective. And then there's the more abstract and the more specific. So we have entities in their context, emergent behaviors, and the mechanisms that connect the entities with those emergent properties. That's our knowledge about systems. Then we've got engaging with systems. So we've got the more logical and the more insightful, and the more theoretical and the more practical. So the know why, the know what, the know how, and the wisdom. This just coming up with these diagrams to try and communicate the detailed content in a more abstract way was incredibly difficult. So this is the knowledge about systems. So across the top, we've got those phases. So we've got the ideas, the frameworks, the principles, and the assets in the context of the whole. And you can see that this maps onto things like OODA. So observe, orient, decide, act, and then the realization. So that's one dimension. The other dimension of structuring the knowledge is based on form, function, and fit. And this relates really nicely to what Ollie was explaining about different levels of complexity, the structural, the functional, and the organizational. So those are different knowledge categories against the phases of the development of the knowledge. And now what we can now do is in the intersections under concepts, we can identify the structures, we can identify the terms, the ideas, the words we use when we're communicating, engaging in that concept space. So in the area of form, we've got two subcategories: the identity of wholes, the togetherness of things, the behavior of the wholes, the processes of things. So these are the terms we use in those particular spaces. Then when we move into the general theory frameworks, and many of these theories already exist. Yeah. Also, what I can do here is I can say to you that this is not completely right, but it's on the right kind of lines in terms of, I'm trying to give you an idea of what could fit in here and what logically fits in here. But this is just candidate, yeah? And there's loads of stuff that's missing, but this is how we organize the knowledge. So from those theoretical frameworks, we can then slot in and develop principles about that work within those particular frames. And the ones that are labeled in terms of numbers, these come from George Mobus's Systems Principles book. But I've also put in some sort of like very simple principles which can be derived from those frameworks. Simply understanding that simple things combine into more complex things. And if you look at the bottom, the more complex something is, the richer is its experience. Yeah. One thing I'd like to emphasize is don't dismiss the necessity of complexity. When we engineer systems, we're actually trying to create a certain level of complexity. That's the whole point. And when you look at the origins of the term, a complex is a coming together. So we've got assets and then, you know, the context of the whole. So that's how we organize our knowledge, our general knowledge about systems universally. Now, I'm now showing you a slide which goes into how we engage with systems. Yeah. Now, the ovals are 9 transformational powers. They're the motivations for change. This is, although it looks very static, this is actually a dynamic model. So you've got in the bottom left-hand quadrant, you've got new signals, emergent events, and relationships. And the powers that are in place there are spirit, living, philosophy, the political, and the social. The political is a central balancing power, which is essentially around everything. Everything moves around it. The clouds are general systems pathologies, which we experience in our everyday lives, in our programs and our projects. And the arrows represent pathways to resolve those pathologies through the enactment of the power. Underneath all of those arrows, we've mapped on something like 20 different works on systems thinking and systems acting. And we've given voice to the pathway. Again, this overall map is an instantiation of the relational holon. You know, I don't have time to go into the details of this and explain it fully. Yeah. So these are the positive pathways. Now, these are the negative pathways. These are the pathways that we have to work against. This is all part and parcel of our job as systems engineers. Our job is to mitigate or to resolve these pathologies and the pathways which are leading to these pathologies. So if you look at the political center, for instance, the reluctance to change, the manipulation of information, the manipulation of relationships, the benefits to the parts and not the whole. These are the things that we encounter every single day. Yeah. Now, these forward pathways and these backward pathways are continuously in operation in our social systems. And our job as systems engineers is to try and create a better balance between the negative and the positive. This is a slide which attempts to give voice to the work products of systems thinking and systems acting. So, you know, the vision, the mission, the objectives, the laws, the policies, conventions, the accountability, the plans, the relationships, the architectures, the designs, the methods, the schematics, the risks. These are all the tangible outcomes of those pathways. Okay. Now, when you take an action space, of which there are 24, no vision of the future situation is the pathology. The political is the power which we're drawing on for the enactment. There's a forward path, and I've showed some of the heuristics on that path. The outcome is the agree vision, mission, objectives with key stakeholders. But what we can, and there's a reverse path which shows the heuristics that we know about, the negative path. What we can do is we can label in this space and make explicit the concepts which are applicable in this space, the frameworks which are useful in this space, like the capability architecture, for instance. We can identify genuine principles based on our understanding of this space and the pathways. And we can also put in this space our knowledge in terms of what assets we know are useful in this area, like stakeholder influence maps, as in 2B analysis, problem and opportunity statements. And our actual process, which is applicable in this space, is business and mission analysis. And we have 34 ISO 15288 processes, if I haven't lost count. We've got 21 of these action spaces. What I envisage is we'll look at ISO 15288 with new eyes, using this framework, and work out what processes we really need because everything we've got at the moment is heuristics based. It's served us well, but it can certainly be improved. Now, when we reflect on Kinefin and our collaboration, because collaboration has been a real theme, I think, so far in this conference. Yeah, when we look at these different spaces, and again, this is an instantiation of the relational holon. Yeah, in the perceived chaotic, we've got information and observation. When we move into the complex space, we're organizing our information into knowledge. We're creating architectures. Architectures are appreciation of the wholeness in the context of the utilization of the system. Designs are where we enact the forces and the power to manipulate energy and mass. So in terms of systems engineering, and we already know this, but it needs to be beyond systems engineering. We need a common vocabulary. We need to get organized. We need to collaborate. And we need to get out there and do good. And I saw this in Raoul's presentation in the plenary just before this. And we need to create order from disorder. That's fundamentally our job.
Thank you, Gary. And I'll introduce our third panelist, Lydia Kaiser. She is the chair of the Department of Digital Engineering 4.0 at the Technical University in Berlin and the Einstein Center for Digital Future. She teaches and does research in the field of systems engineering with a focus on design and product development. In 2021, she was appointed to the Digital Council of the German Federal Ministry of Defense. She received her PhD in 2013 in the field of model-based systems engineering and has worked at the Heinz Nickdorf Institute at Paderborn University and the Fraunhofer Institute for Mechatronic System Design. Lydia.
Thank you very much. Before I start to share my thoughts, I would like first to say thank you for INCOSE to inviting me, and thank you for us to inviting me to speak on two panels and to speak to two hard topics. So the one is empowering women in engineering, and that was the panel yesterday. And today, talk about systems engineering and do research in systems engineering. So I have no slides. I will present my personal point of view to share a little bit how I go through my research career path, and so that you understand that I am doing research on systems engineering for now 15 years, but very new at the international floor. So this is the first time for me at the International Symposium. I did not have a time or opportunity to talk to my panelists before. But I hope to show you another point of view, a point of a very passionate researcher, and a point of view of another country. It's from Germany. Okay, so I would go through three parts. First, I would like to show you my research and how I go through that path. What I'm doing now, and especially as a professor, right now for 2 years, and what I assume we have to address to make systems engineering as a real science. Okay, let's start. As you heard, I did my master in physics and started with systems engineering. But when I went to do my PhD at a professor, he worked and developed new ideas how we create new products. It was called the product development process itself. And so that was the first time I got in touch with systems engineering. And we did research on a very fundamental area. And that means we did it in our office. We thought about how to bring people together give them a language, give them methods and tools to communicate, to bring the different disciplines together, like mechanical, electrical, and software engineer, so that at the end, they have a common understanding of the system and create new solutions that are not only in one discipline that makes the system as an intelligent technical system. So that means my research first fundamental, doing in the office. After that, we went out and had the opportunity to work with many industry partners from diverse domains. They have had, so like Miele, we on washing machines, or we work with VIA, it's an enterprise doing separators. So very diverse industry partners, but they had in common that they go through this process by being influenced by all this technology that rise. And that makes possible that our systems change. And we make those not only mechanical optimized, but we can make new solutions so that the system at all become intelligent. And we did this research. We had at the end, we had two kinds of projects. The one was we did research by we did engineering new systems, new intelligent systems, cooperating with those industry partners by applying our own methods and tools. That means applying systems engineering. And on the other hand, we did research on fundamentals. That means research on the topic systems engineering itself. And that was very powerful. So 2 years ago, I became a professor at the University of Berlin. And I had to think about two things. First of all, I had to build up new courses, lectures. And of course, I wanted to do that in systems engineering. And the other was to find in the new area a comparable ecosystem where we can cooperate with industry partners and do ongoing with the research on systems engineering. So let me tell you a little bit more about what I've done with my courses, and then I will share how I try to find a comparable ecosystem. So the first is I did the courses to understand it. It's in a faculty that is has more master degrees or master programs, mechanical engineering and nearby programs. So I thought I would like to all those come to my course and teach them in very basics. That means to teach them vocabulary so that they know what we are talking about systems, what's complexity, but it's also what is the development of a system that and looking at the whole process, understanding that development is part of the enterprise, to understand how it changed over time, where we came from, what the systems changed over time, and what does that mean for the engineering of those systems, and as well as what does that mean for the enterprise for those that engineering system. So that was the basics. Then I wanted to train them or to teach them also in main concepts, methods, tools, but only very on a basic level, so that at the end they had the opportunity to train their system thinking. And I did that by using different methods so that they could understand that we can take a holistic view on a system by using methods and looking from different perspectives. So then I built up MBSE and other courses, problem-based learning, where they could apply those methods. And another, because I love the research, so I built up a new course that is research on systems engineering. So to teach them also that they have to think about that this is a science. This is also, we have many questions that has been answered, and how to do that. We focus on this course, and also what is, for example, presenting the results during conferences and such things. Okay, that was the courses and lectures, but becoming a professor, it's also being visible for new people that didn't work with me before. And that was very interesting because many people come from other disciplines. So the first, I worked close by the industry. Now people came from application areas like smart city. They came to me from the mobility, logistics, or civil security. So they came to me and also telling me technology is a driver for us. Our systems are changing. We need to develop those things. We have to handle complexity, interdisciplinarity, and so on. How to do that? What is systems engineering? Please tell us about that. And we thought about how could that work? Because yeah, I was invited to many keynotes explaining the idea behind that, but it's still only a starting point. But at the end, I was thinking about how to create systems or structures where we can have this powerful set I knew from my first institute. That means a set where we have the application area as the context and doing engineering. So engineering those systems in this application area by applying systems engineering approach, applying digital engineering. All that stuff we are talking about here is powerful to create new systems and give that tools and that methods to the engineers that are from different disciplines, that are from different application areas. And on the other side, build up research, do still research on systems engineering. That means developing methods, tools, and then combine them, because that's the power behind that. We have the opportunity to enable the other engineers to create systems. And then we have research data from those by applying all those methods and can make our methods tools better. Because both areas are driven by technology. We have the technology that influence our systems and become intelligent, but also we have influence on our how we do systems engineering and engineering itself. That means both have research questions, and we have to answer that. And by connecting both, I think that could be a powerful combination. So this was a little bit my point of view to show you how I go through what were the thoughts. And my questions I would like to discuss also on this panel is how to address and how to teach and communicate systems engineering and systems approach to different stakeholders. Because that was what I had to do. But when people came to me from civil security, to try explain them that on that level that they understood the idea behind and could apply that to their work. So that means for me, systems engineering to communicate, to train it, it's not the only stakeholder can be the systems engineer itself. So, and then the second question is how to build up ecosystems, build up infrastructure to enable those engineering systems by applying digital engineering and systems engineering. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lydia. So before I open the floor up for questions, because we are running a little bit ahead of schedule and under budget, I wanted to give each panelist the opportunity to react to what the other panelists said. So since Ollie has had the longest time to think about it, since he went first, I'm going to give him first dibs, and then Gary, if you want to go second, third, if you have any remarks, reactions from the panelists.
Great, thank you. Well, it's been really a pleasure to be up here and listening to both of you. And Gary, your T-shirt is super cool. My favorite is the CH element. It's Chewbacca. That's my favorite. But the point is, I vehemently agree with Gary on the alchemy to chemistry, right, analogy. And I think we talked about this at the IW as well. But if you think about, we had a vote, actually, some of you were there. We asked you roughly where would you situate system engineering in the history of science, you know, for comparing it to chemistry. And I think the answer was, I thought like 1830 maybe, but actually the majority said 1780. So it was actually even less mature in your perception, in the INCOSE community perception than I thought. And you know, that I think that's right. You know, INCOSE is now 30 years old, not quite yet, but we're getting there. That's a very small fraction of time compared to, you know, the centuries that it took for, you know, alchemy to become chemistry. You know, the discovery of the periodic table of element. Now we're looking at it and it looks complete, but it had gaps in it, right, for decades. And so I think we need to be forceful, but we also need to be humble and patient. And what makes alchemy different from chemistry is that in alchemy, there's a lot of trial and error, right? You're combining different ingredients and not sure what the outcome will be. But if you get something good and if you wrote it down, well, that's a recipe. And then hopefully you repeat that recipe in a different city or a different country, you may get the same or similar result, but of course the ingredients might be slightly different. So the point is, what we want in system science and system engineering is starting with some initial conditions, with some ingredients, with people, with processes, and we want the outcome to be very predictable. Like in chemistry, if you implement a chemical reaction equation properly, you should get a very predictable outcome. And right now in system engineering, our outcomes are very stochastic, right? They're not predictable enough. So predictability of outcomes is what we want. And then Professor Kaiser, Lydia, I really, we haven't known each other very long, but I'm so glad you joined the INCOSE community. And as a physicist, going into system engineering, I'm sure you, and from your remarks, I got the experimentation. How do we get buy-in? How do we convince people that the principles that we are uncovering and formalizing in system engineering are valid? The way that it worked in physics is experimentation. And if you think about it, we have two kinds of experiments that we're running in the world of system engineering. We have natural experiments. So for example, Ricardo, your work on COSISMO, you build a database of actual programs that have happened, you look at their outcomes, and you're mapping, you know, in an empirical sense, the relationships. But you didn't control those projects. They just happen, and then you capture what were the outcomes. Those are natural experiments. And we have natural experiments in physics as well. And then controlled experiments, right? Where we bring people into a much more confined environment, but we can control the variables of the experiments and observe the outcomes with different interventions, different SE principles or methods or tools. And we control the outcomes. And I think experimentation, the importance of experimentation to convince stakeholders from many different domains is what I got from your remarks.
So first of all, I really appreciate the rigor. Try again. I really appreciate the rigor that you've been applying and the thoughtfulness you've been applying to, you know, that exploration of complexity. It's interesting because when you were doing the workshop and explaining your approach, there were quite a few people who were engaging and saying, "Oh, he's using the wrong words. You know, he's talking about complicated, not complexity." But I could see where you were going, yeah, and I was happy for you to be using the words that you were using in the way you were using it because I knew what you meant. But continuing on the analogy with chemistry, yeah. So the situation often for the systems engineers is that the laboratory is already set up and the reaction is already in place, and you know things aren't going well, and we've been told to basically sort out the reaction and get it back into a more effective way of working. But unless the key message really for systems engineering and systems science, the systems approach, is we've got to be there right at the very beginning as soon as the opportunity is identified. And if we start after the contract, when the project is set up, it's already far too late. We're already doomed. Yeah, it's going to blow up, and all we can do is control the explosion. Yeah, yeah. The other analogy with alchemy is that the idea with alchemy was they were trying to turn lead into gold. Yeah, and we're often unfortunately turning gold into something else. Lydia, the thing that really resonated with me, what you were saying was, how do we communicate with the key stakeholders in a way that is understandable for them, meaningful for them, so that we can ensure we're out there at the very beginning. I really liked Raoul's talk on visualization earlier today. I think we need to get Raoul involved in the Fuse initiative to help us with that messaging and the visualization of what we need. So I'm just really glad to be here.
Thank you. I'm also to be here and be part of this panel because I read the vision and my students had to read the vision and repeat that to the others. And I was very glad that to see that there's an initiative started with Fuse, with those pillars, and be part of it and just try to come into understanding all your thoughts. This is what I really appreciate. So it is for me quite new everything and understand. I have to rethink all of that what you have said, but I like the idea that. So I thought the idea that you mentioned it, that we have different complexities and we have to understand which part of complexity we're talking about and how to also make this more mathematic and rely on mathematics to understand how it's made. And yeah, thank you very much.
Great. So the floor is open for questions, and I just have two small requests. If you could just introduce yourself when you give the question, and then the second request is if there is a question for a specific panelist, please make that known, or if it's open to any panelists, let us know either way so that they're prepared. Please, go ahead.
Maarten Bonnema, Professor of Systems Engineering, University of Twente, the Netherlands. Love the panel. Great, very nice things. And I could give a lot of thoughts and ideas. I will not do that. But I've heard a few things: laboratory, connections with industry, ingredients for a recipe to do controlled experiments. A short reaction, I think our laboratory is the industry, where we simply have to connect very closely. And the ingredients. Ollie, you showed the system, so the structure, the functions, and the organization. Should we also include the tooling as an ingredient? Because we have to have so much tooling to make sense of the complexity and the things we do. Would it be maybe in the recipe that we have now a missing ingredient?
Great. Lydia, maybe you want to talk about the industry connection, but I'll try to, where does the tooling go?
Exactly.
So the processes and tools that we use to analyze, develop, test, validate, verify, validate systems, the tools are owned by the organization. So to me, they're in the organizational complexity. The methods and tools that we use or do not use will be one of the drivers of the organizational complexity. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're in a 1970s or 1960s engineering bullpen designing a new airplane. every engineer will be sitting in the same room, more or less. They'll all be sitting at drafting boards, right, with drawings, and they'll make drawings, and then they'll pass the drawing 2 rows back. So co-located, no software, ink and Mylar, right? Those are the tools. And then of course experience. And that's a relatively simple kind of organization. The tools are simple, but there are limits to what that kind of organization can produce. Then fast forward 2023, you have 5 different offices, one in Seattle, one in Toulouse, one in the Netherlands, one in Japan, one in Australia. They're all using CATIA. So that's good, that helps, but the geographical distribution is enormous. So in some sense, the combination of the people, where they are, their knowledge, the tools they use, digital versus non-digital, becomes both the driver of the complexity of that organization in the PDP, the product development process, but it also has a huge impact on the outcomes.
But the tooling, I think we drag in a whole different side of it, because the tooling is developed by other organizations like IBM, like Dassault Systèmes, etc. And as the organization making use of it, we do not have control of them. So that's, I think, an added ingredient. Or
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So, any thoughts? Okay. Because when we started to work with those industries, they didn't understand what systems engineering is. We had to explain. They said, "No, that's rocket science for us. We don't need that." At the end, we just used our methods, and then they understood the idea behind that. But I think, yes, we have many complexities we have to take into account, and tooling is one of that. I would say it's in the organization, it's the infrastructure we use for development or to create systems. And this is also in a very huge change. As you mentioned, those tools are developed by others person, and it's very interesting to look into history, how they are, what way they are going.
exactly.
And that most of them started with a own purpose, and then integrating many aspects we want to do with the systems during the systems engineering process. And for industry partners, it's very hard to understand which tool to use, how to build out the infrastructure, and what tool is provided, how to build up the digital thread. That's a very huge complexity.
And it's interesting, while I look at you, I also look at the slide behind you, and our gold sponsors are not users of systems engineering, but they are tool providers. So I think we might even have to introspective look at ourselves as INCOSE. Are we not driven too much by the tools? But that's the final report.
Before the next question, I'm just going to ask for shorter answers and shorter questions. Just for courtesy,
Yeah.
get everybody here, but also, JB, is there anybody online who's posed a question? Okay. Great. Okay, I'll just keep looking at you.
Kamran Shahrudi, Systems Fellow at Woodward and also Professor of Systems Engineering at Colorado State. I loved the presentations, and thank you for the alchemy to chemistry transformation. My thoughts are about what part of this framework is exportable to other disciplines like social sciences, politicians, lawyers. And I don't know what your mental model is of politicians, for example, but I don't see them exercise a complexity equation or apply an MBSE tool set. That would be very unusual that we would have a politician like that, or even decision makers at companies that make better rockets and better airplanes. So I think maybe starting with Gary and then to the rest of the panel, what are your thoughts about as we expand our focus to larger complex problems? What is the essence, or where is the most convenient place to start exporting some of our thinking?
Well, so first of all, the model is universal. It is transdisciplinary. We've already started having some discussions with project management organizations, for instance, about how we could also underpin their processes and map in their processes, because it's essentially all operating in the same space. Yeah, we should be very much working as partners with project management organizations, and I think that a framework like this will do an awful lot to promote partnerships, collaborations, and to identify synergies and to improve communication and understanding across disciplines. That was the whole point of general systems theory from the outset.
Yeah.
We've just not yet achieved it because we weren't able to organize it. But I think we really are on the cusp of being able to do that. And I want to see INCOSE, the ISSS, engaging with OR, the PMI, systems dynamics, school of systems change, regenerative society, all of those organizations, we all have the same goals, essentially, a better world through a systems approach. And I really hope that we can do that. And I just hope it can help.
Thanks.
Well, the political, do politicians do system engineering, or should they? I will say it's true, they don't run complexity equations, but I think, the much maligned political system in the US, there are many problems with it at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. But there are organizations that are doing a lot of deep analysis that informs the political process. So if you look in Washington, pejoratively, they're known as Beltway bandits, right? Kamran, you're familiar with that term?
Yes.
But there's an awful lot of good research and analysis that goes into a lot of these organizations. So the data is often there, the analytical capability is there. But the issue is that once that information and analysis gets injected into the political system, which a lot of it comes down to appropriations, right? Budget appropriations and priorities, you have very different rank ordering of the objectives, right? A great example of that is the transformation of the energy infrastructure in the US, between oil and gas, wind, solar. That transformation is happening, but, probably more driven by market forces than by the political process these days. But there is a lot of awful good systems analysis happening in this country, but it's not the politicians themselves doing it, but it's the ecosystem doing it.
So do you believe that will lead to our politicians exercising systems thinking?
Well, I'm trying not to be too negative here. I think there's a big difference between, if you look at the legislative branch, between the Congress and so the House of Representatives and the Senate. As you know, congressmen, congresswomen in the US are only elected for 2 years. So they're barely in office, right? And assigned to some committee, committee on defense, committee on education, whatever committees they are in, because most of the work happens in those committees. They already have to think about their re-election, right, campaign, because it's only a 2-year term. I think that's a big issue. The Senate is a little different, right? Senators are elected for 6 years, and they also have committees. And I think a lot of the more deeper systems thinking about where to invest and how the country should change is actually happening in the Senate, because they're not on a treadmill like the representatives are. That's my personal opinion.
Thanks.
Maybe we should think about we all are part of systems. We have we are right now at the INCOSE. It's an organization that also has a board that is elected. And we think about how often do we use our system thinking, so the way how we act, or how do we use our tools and methods in those systems? Just a thought.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Oliver Gao from Cornell. Thank you to the panel for the great and also inspiring talks. So I heard from this whole several days of the conference, I heard four themes. There are grandmother hers, humans, systems, and data and AI. These four themes. Among these four, humans are the only one that can take intentional actions, right? So for intentional actions to be taken in the right way, the key is really education, right? So speaking of this, Gary, you talk about all this, chemistry, right? We have different sciences and engineering disciplines, which we believe that kind of, they're in silos. They have the benefit of teaching people to do things right. But I believe a lot of people here, we believe that system engineering is a discipline that can teach people to do the right things. So now my question is, from your perspective, how are we going to do the education of system engineering, especially given we feel that strongly the system engineering compared to many other disciplines is falling behind, all right? It needs to be yet established as a very well-established and defined discipline. So on that basis, how are we going to carry out our education? So how can we teach and tell the society to do the system engineering right? So that's one thing. And another thing is that given that we are still yet to establish this field, do you feel a sense of urgency to make sure that people can do the things right? Because other Indian disciplines, they teach people to do the things right. What if they do the things right, but in the wrong direction? Before they know the system engineering that teach them to do the right thing. Thank you.
I'll have to go first. So in terms of education, I think that there's a lot that could be learned by looking at the Waters Foundation. I think they've rebadged themselves in the Waters Center now. They have something called the Habits of the Systems Thinker, and they teach kids how to do systems thinking. And I think that that is something that we should have in all of our education systems. It should be something done globally, as a foundational course, because we all know that, at schools at the moment, we teach people facts. We don't teach them how to think anymore. Yeah. And when you do think, you get told off. Yeah. And maybe the large majority of the people in this room are the people who did badly at school, because they thought wrong. Well, doing the right things at the right time in the right way. I think it was INCOSE who said, doing the wrong thing right, it just makes it wronger. So completely agree. And there is a crisis at the moment, absolutely. But I also see there's a growing recognition and consciousness globally that things can't go on as they have been, and there is much more appetite and social pressure for political change. We just can't go on the way we are at the moment, and I do think that INCOSE has a part to play in that, a humble part to play, but I think we can have a part to play in that global change.
I really like the work you mentioned, the Waters Foundation, and how they go to schools. And in Germany, we also have those problems. And I think it's very common there. So that we have to change the educational system, but it's not that easy because first of all, it's not the focus is not there. Everything is more important than to educate our children. That's very sad, but that's the way it is. And so in Germany, we have one initiative. I really like it. It's called Schule im Aufbruch, like school on move. And they try to bring another form of learning, project-based learning, to understand we need different people. And they find themselves the projects by they teach them in the SDGs, And from that, the children find their own problems and try to solve that at school. And they find time in the school that they can solve those problems. And it makes those children very powerful because now they understand they can be an actor and be part of the change. So, and I think it will change because the most of the people I talk to, they are driven by a purpose, and the purpose is to change the world and to make it better, and not that much from technology.
If I could just add one thought. First of all, Oliver, congratulations on your program at Cornell. The system engineering program at Cornell is really world class. So you're doing a lot of things already very well. So I just wanted to say that to you. Let's look at a lot of business schools that, business schools, we can criticize them. They do not everything right, but the case study method. So our neighbors up the river, Harvard Business School is very well known for really being a leader in the business, the case study method. So a lot of the way that the learning happens is looking at, they're not fictitious, they're actually based on real companies, real strategic dilemmas, things that have happened, sometimes failures, sometimes successes. I think it would do us a lot of good as a community to develop a rich set of system engineering case studies, a la Harvard Business School, which could also become an INCOSE product, right? And in those case studies, we would analyze, for example, a failure that happened from multiple lenses using, the SE handbook and methods that we teach in system engineering. The case studies are very engaging. You can read them, you can discuss them, you can learn from them. You still need the theory, of course, underlying it, but let's develop some really, really strong cases, a rich library of system engineering case studies. That would go a long way.
Thank you very much. I like the case study. I get a lot. We'll go back and implement that. Thank you.
Before we go to the next in-person question, if you could just hold, and we're going to go to a virtual contribution. JB, tell us what we got. Thank you, Ricardo. Can you hear me? Right. So we had a question from Joshua Sutherland, and he sort of makes the observation that an analogy is being drawn with chemistry and physical sciences, especially moving to more predictability with the repeatable experiments. And given the current discussion they just had, and given people are such an important factor of our systems, do social systems departments of business schools and how they do research provide us a path to uncovering SE foundations?
Well, I'm going to take a roundabout route to answering the question. Yeah. So I don't know how many people here have read Foundation by Isaac Asimov. Yeah. And he invented a science called psychohistory. And one of the premises for psychohistory was that you could not predict the actions of an individual person. But when you looked at societies as a whole, things became more predictable. Yeah. And I think that is a truism. Yeah. I think that system science is a lot about probability space and what might be possible. Yeah. I think using systems engineering and system science, we can improve the probability of us delivering a program to time, quality, and cost, and meeting a level of stakeholder expectations which is deemed to be successful. But even with system science, there's always going to be some level of uncertainty, some outliers. Yeah. But we need to move away from the 20% success to more like 80 or 90%. Yeah, because that's where we are at the moment.
Well, Joshua has been helping also with the Fuse foundations and running these experiments that we mentioned. And what we're seeing is huge variability in, for example, just the time to solve these problems. And I was kind of surprised by how variable things seem to be. And this is that, you have individual variability. And then you have society. So I've actually read the Foundation series, and so have you seen the episode? It's fantastic, right? It's a wonderfully done series. So you've got the individual behaviors, and then you've got societal behaviors. So N very large, millions of people. But system engineering happens in smaller groups, right? It's like dozens of people or a couple hundred people working together. And that is really tricky because now you're not yet, the N isn't large enough so things average out. So, but you're no longer at the individual sort of outcomes level. So how do you really predict the outcome of the work of dozens of people working together, each of them having huge variability? That's tricky. And there's not a lot of research, whether it's in psychology or social sciences, that works at that mesoscale.
Just to respond to Ollie, I think it may not give us a complete solution, but I think actually COSISMO does help, because COSISMO, you might want to talk about this a little bit, Ricardo, I don't know, but COSISMO looks at lots of different factors for predicting systems engineering effort, and it actually scales it to overall engineering effort and program level effort as well. And one of the factors in there is essentially systems engineering capability, in terms of the level of experience, how long those experienced people have been in that context, stakeholder cohesion, et cetera, So using those kind of factors, we could probably get a better handle on the individual situations and use those in our predictions. So, you know, if you'd factored in those capability areas, sort of organizational capability areas into your overall schema, you might have got some more precise results.
Gary, I'll just say that it excites me when people talk about that, but it also scares me because I know the error in the model. Yeah. And it's published, so people should know. All right, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mike Green, and I'm on the faculty at Naval Postgraduate School, where I've been for the last 21 years. And I have more of a comment than a question. Okay, now as an example, if I can be familiar, Ali, I've used your book in my classroom, so I'm familiar with the book. I've read it. All right, but I also know Derek Hitchens, and I'm very familiar with his writings, and he and I communicate periodically on that, and I recognize that in Gary's. You know, you basically, I think Derek would agree with everything that you had up there. My point is, I've worked with systems for over 60 years. I enlisted in the Navy, and I grew up with the strategic weapons system all the way up through the weapons officer and navigator of 4 SSPNs. That is a system, a true system. I went from there to Lockheed Martin, where I was a technical director for the Norwegian frigate. Okay, I've worked on other frigate designs for the Greeks, for the Norwegians. So I've worked in Europe, and I've worked in system engineering teams. I disagree with you, Ollie, in that I don't think it's that immature a discipline. The stuff I saw at Lockheed Martin goes back into the 60s. It is well developed. They had very professional companies do that, and it is a system. The Aegis system is a system that has basically been around now since what, about 77? And here we are in 23, and it's still growing, still being used. My experience with the whole thing is more along the lines of what Gary is talking about. I find that we are too faddish in the systems engineering community. We don't recognize the history of systems engineering. We do things like object-oriented development, almost to the extent of visualization, because back in the 90s, we were starting to develop tools, and we went away from them because of the object-oriented paradigm. And it's been, I don't know how many years now, that we're just finally getting back to getting tools that are usable. So that possibly causes, as a result of, you know, what you observe, Ali. All right, but I'm on Gary's side for the most part. And I also like the idea of visualization. However, I found that too many people. I started as a draftsman in 1958. Okay, think about that. That's Ollie's work. All right, there are too many people that cannot visualize this microphone. They have to put their hands on it. They have to see it. And I would say that is the bulk of the population. So when we look at tools, we have to think about things like that. The final point that I want to talk about is alchemy is making a comeback. Colorado is an example. I work in solid state materials a great deal, solid state radars and things like that. I'm very interested in things like solar arrays and so on. The way they work are developing solid state materials now is that they have programs that will actually run simulations of how a whole group of semiconductor materials will come together and which ones will be most efficient and which ones, and can they be manufactured in large quantities. It's worth taking a look at the Colorado State program because that is all coming in its definition, I think. So my comments.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Yang Zhao, Associate Professor from University of Oslo and the University of Southeastern Norway. First of all, appreciate the panel and the floor to lift up to discuss the fundamental of system engineering, which is relevant to science, as you clearly mentioned. So on the way to seek the truth as a researcher, as an educator, I think the truth matters to every one of us, like who we are, where we go, and how we do things, and how we work together. So my question is really, in your view, what are the limitations of system engineering, or in general, to find the truth? And I have a little sad question because I mostly position myself on Earth. Maybe to Ollie, it's a curiosity or possibility that if we get explored to the space, it will get us one step further to the truth.
Okay. Wow, what a great question. Well, what is the truth? Yeah, that's been, we used to think the truth was obvious, right? But now it's no longer obvious. But here's what I believe. So if you look culturally, the systems that system engineering has, and I think many people at the conference in INCOSE come from sectors like aerospace, defense, transportation, medical devices, physical infrastructure. They're all artificial systems, right, that would never exist in nature on their own. And they have hardware and software at the basis of them. I think we need to start challenging that more because nature, biology, we talk a lot about chemistry, but biology, natural systems, and I know there's a natural systems working group in INCOSE, and I've unfortunately never been able to attend, but we have so much to learn from nature. So the humans, if you have a human operator as part of the system, we are biological, right? We are biological beings. And so it's not just hardware and software, it's hardware, software, and biology all combined, right? And much of, when we design systems, we're looking for macroscopic outcomes from these systems. But if you go back to the fundamentals, like even making a drawing, the prior speaker said, 1958, you're in a drafting room making a drawing. But every stroke on the drawing is the result of cognitive processes, neural processes in the brain. So much of what we try to do in system engineering is have macroscopic outcomes, which themselves are driven by, neural, cognitive processes, biological processes, material science, which is at the grain level in the metal. So the challenge I see to really get to the basis of it is how do we predict macroscopic outcomes when those macroscopic outcomes are really all driven by, processes at the nano level that are combining to give us the macroscopic outcomes. That to me is like the ultimate frontier for system engineering, which means we need to know more about biology also, not just chemistry. Does that make sense?
Of course, and then I pick one word which you mentioned, that the challenge is how to predict. But a lot of times with the background of social science, of course, system engineering, we use the word explanation a lot. I'm not sure I have the time, but could you explain a little bit of the challenges between explanation? It's basically the discovery and the question also you create, right?
Yeah, just to continue building on that. So, you know, regarding the truth, we know that in science that ultimately there is no truth. You know, we can just get closer and closer to it, improving our knowledge, improving our models. You know, now there's a marvelous set of heuristics from the Tao Te Ching, so 81 chapters, which are based on poems, and it's about 4,000 years old, as far as I can remember. I might be wrong on that, but the first poem essentially reflects on the fact that the Tao that you can name is not the universal Tao. And I'd encourage all of the people in this room to take a look at the Tao Te Ching and the translations that are available, and they will deeply resonate with you from a systems perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you.
JP, let's go to the next virtual question.
Thank you, Rada. So we have a question from Douglas Van Hollen, and the question is, as the world gets more complex, will people, especially leaders, become more comfortable with complexity or less? And will our jobs become complexity fear management?
I think, yes, the world is getting complex because, but at the end, it was always complex, wasn't it? We try to handle that by forming disciplines and to understand the world a little bit better. Now everything is get interconnected, and all those technologies helps us to interconnect, and that makes so complex. And I think we have to train ourselves and handle those complexity by understanding that there is a complexity, and that so looking at systems, knowing the context, knowing see the interaction, but not to be able to handle complexity or to control the complexity. It's more understand it and be able to be part of this systems.
For me, I love complexity. Complexity has to be appreciated from my perspective, and you know, my thinking on complexity is that the purpose of an architecture is to appreciate complexity, appreciate the system in its wholeness, and its interactions with its environment. That's the purpose. That's the true purpose of architecture. There's another wonderful book. I can't remember if I got the title exactly right, but it's Being Comfortable with Uncertainty. And again, some wonderful explanations in that. I'll check on the title later. But yeah, I love complexity. If it wasn't for complexity, not only wouldn't be here as a species, we need the complexity to be here. But also, if it wasn't for complexity, there would be no need for systems engineers.
David Shrunk. I'm the co-chair of the Systems Engineering and Lawmaking Working Group. And thank you for the panel, and I enjoyed your discussions very much, very much. There's a problem with our lawmaking process. We're focusing on the state governments of the United States. The lawmaking process, as we've reviewed it, is not a knowledge-based process. It's not a problem-solving process. There's no follow-up evaluation. We produce lots of laws. The state governments produce annually between 10 and 40,000 laws per year, every year. So the solution, we think, is to expand systems engineering into the field of laws and lawmaking. And that systems engineering is eminently suited to the creation and validation of laws. And this would not involve legislatures. Legislatures would contract out perhaps, design of laws to expert groups that can create laws that are effective in solving societal problems. So that's what we're working on. And I think it's eminently possible that systems engineering will have a big role to play in the creation and validation of laws in the future. And by the way, I gave a talk on this Monday, and I used the analogy that we are currently in the state of alchemy and we're moving towards chemistry. So I really appreciated your analogy. That's just a comment. That's it. No question.
So I really appreciate and I agree with you that the system engineering can be applied and should be applied to the analysis and improvement and synthesis of systems of law. My brother is a lawyer. He did a PhD on comparative jurisprudence. When you have international issues and multiple international jurisdictions are at play, potentially, for example, what are the rights and privileges of members of the International Red Cross, right, as they operate in different countries? It's very complex. So if I may ask a question back to you, I guess the two major systems of law on this planet are common law, right? The British sort of system, which is heavily based on case law, and then there's the Roman law, at least in the Western civilization. Do you see those as they have a very different architecture, right? Like, could you explain if you see those as very different? The system engineering applied, is one more in line with system engineering than the other?
I'm not an expert on case law. It evolves over centuries and becomes the norm. And that's by practice. What we're focusing on is the formation of laws as we do in legislatures through the legislative process by identifying problems, which isn't being done. Problems are not defined. It's very simple. That this process needs to be dramatically revised. It should be a problem-solving process, and it is not. So our focus is on the legislative process as we do it in the state governments. So don't know if that answers your question exactly, but it's our narrow focus. And if we can prove this, then we can expand it. So one thing that I'm taking too much time here, maybe. I looked at, I was so impressed with the advances of science. I'm a medical doctor. Tremendous advances in medicine. What happened? Why are we so incapable of solving societal problems? So I said, well, I'm going to go to a law library. I'm going to find out how laws work. And the law libraries are full of precedent opinions. They are not books of knowledge. So we need to create a new science of laws and an engineering discipline of laws. And then go at the legislative process to identify problems and find optimum solutions and actually solve societal problems. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Hello, Thailand Topchev, Assistant Professor of Systems Engineering from Virginia Tech. This is too low for me. Anyway, okay, I would like to state an observation and a concern and then ask for your opinions about how we can make progress. So establishing the foundations of systems engineering has been an ongoing issue for I don't know how many decades. There has been a number of NSF workshops, INCOSE workshops, studies, papers, calls, papers, and we haven't really been able to achieve that. And which is good for someone like me who's a first year tenure track professor. But so my observation is thinking about complexity, and yes, it's our gig as systems engineers to wrestle with complexity and make it work. But even in such a fundamental issue, such as measurement of complexity, which is a necessary precursor for its management. So there's still so much disagreement and struggle. So like we published a study in Journal of Mechanical Design in 2021 with Zoe Shane-Farber. And the paper is called, So You Think Your System is Complex, How and Why Existing Complexity Measures Rarely Agree. So we surveyed the literature and identified some archetypical approaches to quantify complexity. And we designed a controlled experiment where we can abstract properties of complexity as we understand it as a community. And we found that none of the measures that we have developed over the years are actually able to consistently identify control changes of complexity. And when we looked into the reason why this was happening, we actually found that there's a dichotomy regarding what complexity means and how we are trying to understand it. So people who are approaching this from a more physics-based perspective, such as mechanical or aerospace engineering, are looking into a different kind of complexity, whereas people who are coming from like information sciences or communication have a totally different understanding of it. And even though researchers have done a good job in terms of validating their measures, they have only validated it in their own mental models and not to the broader sense of it. So given that we are struggling with this sort of stuff, my question is, for us to be able to establish a foundation of systems engineering, don't we need to be breaking down these barriers of traditional disciplinary silos and communicating with each other? Because as you pointed out, I would actually push against it. I think nature has always been complex. It's our ability to deal with it. We are limited in terms of our cognitive bandwidth. That's why we created these disciplines, so that we can divide and conquer it to the extent that we can study it. However, systems are becoming more complex and now autonomous and intelligent and operating in different domains. So how do we communicate across boundaries as a community of INCOSE? And also, how do we communicate among researchers and practitioners, because we know that we don't really listen to each other?
Yeah, no, I really do appreciate what you're saying in the nature of the problem. Yeah, completely agree. So when general systems theory was first conceived, by the founders back in the 50s and 60s, the reason why they were doing it was because they saw very much the problem you were talking about. And the whole point of general systems theory was it provided a set of concepts, principles, patterns that were universal across everything. And the idea was that it would become essentially a meta science, a science across sciences. And the whole purpose was to bridge those gaps and to create, a transdisciplinary, foundation. And we're still not quite there. Yeah. The other thing I'd like to say is that, that overall paradigm was incredibly powerful, and the ISSS, which was, it used to be the Society for General Systems Theory, I think that was its original name. Its membership grew to several thousand members. But because they struggled to come to a common shared orientation, the society broke apart into many different organizations like Systems Dynamics, the society, cybernetics, lots, because on the one hand, it was very successful because it had that vision, and lots of people got excited. But then what happened is that it fragmented because they couldn't come to a shared understanding. And I think that was largely because it was too young. I mean, Ollie mentioned it earlier. It took a few hundred years for chemistry to become chemistry. And I think that we're in a much better position now to be able to bring about what was the vision of the founders. And I think there's an appetite for it, but I think also the timing is right, because we absolutely desperately need it now in the society and the problems that we have. We've got to get our act together, or otherwise, there is an existential crisis for our species, and unless we get our act together and raise our level of consciousness and cooperation, we are doomed. Yeah, and it's got to happen in the next 10, 15 years.
I think what we need, so I totally resonate with everything you said. It's very you want to label it. If we cannot find and agree what the first law is, we are truly doomed. And So we talk chemistry, we talk alchemy, thermodynamics, is really a great history of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is very simple, right? It's that the change in internal energy of a system. So first of all, you need a boundary around the system. You need to agree what the control volume is, which is not easy, right, for many of our systems. But once you have that defined, the change in internal energy of that system is simply equal to the amount of heat that you add minus the work performed by the system. It took 150 years for the first law of thermodynamics to be universally agreed, verified by experiments. People like Boltzmann and Clausius and Lord Kelvin, in Scotland, they all worked on it, and Carnot in France, et cetera, et cetera. And there were fights, there were disagreements. It was tough, right? But after 150 years, that first law was universally accepted, and it's universally accepted today. And if that hadn't happened, that really acrimonious process of agreeing to the first law, thermodynamics wouldn't exist as a discipline, right? And so we need to go through that process as a community, which the first step of a first law is agreeing on what is the conserved quantity. How do you define a system boundary? And then what is the conserved quantity in the system? Every first law in every scientific discipline, certainly in the physical sciences, has a first law that has a conserved quantity at its base.
Ollie, can I be the first one to propose the first law? All models are wrong. Can we go to a virtual?
I think
or
that
do you have?
was said
Go.
Okay, yeah, I would just agree and to add my experience, because that what I saw when I did research with industry partners. We had to understand them, they had to understand us. And then, of course, to work with different disciplines, and same, we have to break the silos. And it starts at the university, because in Germany we have faculties, and in software science is different, electrical and mechanical. And when I try to build up courses that are transdisciplinary, it's very hard. So, and but I think that's what we can bring in, is also the focus on how to communicate and how to use our methods to bring those disciplines together, to understand, to help them to understand the system and to go through those systems and the process. And that means also that those methods, so that we have to focus on how to use those models as communication part. And I like this presentation in the morning, because that's what we have to address in our research, to make those models also more, or to rethink how we visualize and how we can use that for communication.
I just want to respond, build on what you were saying. I mentioned Tom Stonia earlier. He was an information scientist, and I recently came across his books just 6 months ago. And he expresses that information is as much a part of the universe as energy and mass. And it's organized information which has that property of organizing or directing energy and mass. And he describes information, organized information, as essentially neg entropy. And I think we need to be looking at the relationship of information and entropy when we're looking at that first law. I think that there would be a lot of potential there. And I need to look more at Stonia, and I think that we need to look more at that work, because it has a lot of potential, I think.
Great, thank you.
Thank you all very much.
JV, go ahead.
Yeah, I might quickly get this one in. This is from Antoine Tisson. I think so. The question to the panel he has is, comparing alchemy to chemistry, what are some experimental aspects that you observe in the current way of applying systems engineering?
Could you express that again, please, Jay?
So he's saying, if you're looking at the analogy of comparing alchemy to chemistry, what are some experimental aspects, things that I guess that you can observe in the current way of applying systems engineering? what are some things that we could sort of apply in that context of systems engineering, like that analogy?
So just to follow on, I think this is a good follow-on question to a prior discussion. In alchemy and chemistry, it's about transforming a set of ingredients, physical ingredients, into desired products and minimizing, undesired outputs from chemical reactions, right? Primarily. If you think about the system engineering analogy, system engineering is absolutely an information science, right? Because we are creating abstractions of systems, models, and yes, models are wrong, but some are useful. So it's about if you want to do experimentation and system engineering, they need to be about information at the input and information and artifacts generated at the output, which then eventually are transformed to physical reality. And so the challenge we have is that information, it's not just, I have 4 ingredients sitting in each in their nicely separated bowl on the table in a lab, and then I'm going to boil them together and see what comes out. Information's in our heads, right? It's the memories, the neural information in our brains. Information is in the documents and models that we use. And we then combine this, including then human interaction, right? Verbal information passed back and forth to produce the artifacts of system engineering. So, some of this is not as visible and tangible as it is in chemistry. So we need to be better at designing experiments. And this is again where INCOSE could have a great role, doing benchmark, challenges and experiment, system engineering experimentation, where it's focused on the information exchange and generation, and it's more rigorous in terms of measuring both the inputs and the outputs of those experiments.
Yeah. No, I agree with what you're saying, Ollie, and I can see it going further. So model-based systems engineering is all about generating the information, which is essentially almost like a mirror or a representation of the reality that we're aiming to achieve. And I think that the information which is based in our MBSE environments, those are the ingredients that we're using. Those are the atoms, if you like, that we're bringing together in terms of our molecules. I use the term applied systemics. So when the systemist transforms and engages with systems, they are manipulating systemics. They're engaging with systemics for those transformations. And I think that as our MBSE matures, with the various architectural frameworks that we're using, and if we can ground those concepts, those key terms, those understandings of the system to be, I think we will gradually get closer and closer to what we really want in terms of, a true applied science based on the utilization of those concepts or those systemics. The other thing I'd like to point out, which has just come to mind, is Tom Stonier explains that absolutely everything in the universe is really organized information. And when we do our MBSE, what we're trying to do is we're trying to replicate to a sufficient level that organized information of the systems.
Thank you. We're reaching the top of the hour, but we have a few more minutes left, but we need to start landing this plane. So if we do get through 1 or 2 more questions, that's great. But if there's follow-on dialogue, I encourage you to join us after. So this panel is until 12:10. So go for it.
Yeah, so no pressure there on getting a good question, right?
None.
So Will Barnum with the MITRE Corporation. I'm a principal system security engineer. If I go to ITEA, I go to cybersecurity conference, I come to INCOSE, I don't believe the ultimate answer anymore is 33. It's if we were all there at the beginning, everything would be fine. but we can't physically have all these disciplines in the room at the very beginning of a program project. And as a system engineer, it's our job to kind of, bring in all these different disciplines, understand how to integrate and piece them there. But we're not always there. We're not always at the beginning. But what's the one thing, understanding we can't meet that ultimate question or the ultimate answer anymore? What's the one thing that INCOSE should be doing in the next 2 years? That question for each one of you is, what's that one thing we should be doing in the next 2 years that helps us, solve some of these issues and challenges? Understand we can't be there in the beginning. We can't have all the other disciplines. Where should we be focusing in the next 2 years?
Well, I think the FUSE initiative, the Fundamental of System Engineering initiatives, that's currently ongoing with its different pillars. So foundations, theory, essentially, application areas, and then methods and tools, and really creating a roadmap that integrates that into, bringing us collectively to the next level. That's what we should be doing. That's what we're trying to do. And you're welcome to join any of those pillars if you're more interested in the domain applications, which could yield some really interesting case studies. If you're interested on the theories and laws and fundamental principles, and that means we're not rejecting any of the heuristics, right, that have been collected so far, because there's great work going on in heuristics. But the challenge is the one heuristic I just want to bring here, KISS, keep it simple, stupid, right? You've heard that one, which is that the simplest possible solution to a given problem is always the best, right? That's what you should be doing. That is actually a good heuristic, but it breaks down. It's the wrong answer once you reach a certain threshold of requirements or complexity. Then you do not want to pick the simplest solution. So finding ways to bound where the heuristics that we do have break down, because the underlying theory tells us that, no, you're now in a regime where that heuristic is wrong. You should not apply it. That's where we need to go. And please join us on that journey.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that it's important that we don't just do the FUSE initiative on our own, and that we bring partners and other potential contributors to that. Otherwise, we will end up being too internal focused, and we'll lack perspectives. And I know we're doing it. Just the train of thought.
I joined the INCOSE, and I can't say what the INCOSE has to do, because it's always to understand the organization itself and then maybe make something. But I think what everyone could do. So as systems engineers, you could go also in other domains and maybe, show also the principles, examples, so that others understand the idea behind that and make it more spread the idea. And yes, and bring also examples on the table so that we can discuss the use cases and make it more understandable and more fundamental. But yes, I think that's.
Yeah. So where I was going with this, it was Lord Kelvin who said, around about the time of Einstein's emergence, he said, there's nothing new to be learnt in physics now, only more detailed and detailed measurement. Yeah. And I would say that there's nothing new to be understood in system science now, apart from greater and greater synthesis. Because actually, I would imagine that almost everything is already there, including our heuristics. They just need to be brought together. And I'm bound to be wrong.
Okay, quick question. We got just a few
geez.
minutes left.
Let's see. I had one. Let's see how I can simplify this. So William Reinhardt, I'm here representing myself, but I do model-based systems engineering and defense contractor in the US. I guess my question would be a bit about if you could provide some thoughts on the interplay between complexity, complicatedness, knowledge, and skill. In the context would be, if I had that camera there, and I gave a caveman directions on how to do that, right? They don't have the skill, they don't have the knowledge, they don't have the infrastructure to do that. So how does that play into effort, right? Is there some interplay between those?
So I'm going to give you my answer that, and that's how we teach the difference between complexity and complicatedness at MIT. And I know this may not be compatible with the Kinefin framework and so forth, but so complexity is not in the eye of the beholder. Complexity is a property, an attribute of a system that is measurable by decomposing the system, by looking at its constituent components, interfaces, and topology. That's the structural complexity. Complicatedness is the human perception of that complexity. So if you're a newbie, a rookie in, let's say, in electronics, right, and you're opening an amplifier, and you remove the cover and you look inside, and you're like, wow, that's really complicated, because you're seeing every resistor and you don't know what it does and how it works. But if you worked on amplifiers, you repaired them, you built them, you look at the same amplifier a year later, or some people say 10,000 hours or 5,000 hours of exposure in work and practice makes you an expert. So 10,000 hours, if we work 2,000 hours a year, that's 5 years, right? After 5 years, you look at that same amplifier and it no longer appears complicated to you. Its complexity is exactly the same than it was 5 years earlier, but the complicatedness is not, because you're now seeing the amplifier in a new light. You're seeing that, here are the input outputs, here are the filters over here. You can actually see the flow of electricity in your mind flowing through that amplifier where you couldn't before. And that came through a combination of training and experience. That's how I would see the difference.
So yeah, I've sort of floated around this this for quite some time, constantly changing my mind. I was of the opinion that that complexity was a feature of all systems, and also complicatedness is a feature of all systems. I was going along the lines of it was something that was perceived, But when I read Stonia's work, and Stonia's work took my perceptions and then made it more concrete in terms of things that could be measured, So I'll try and do him some justice, but really it needs to be looked at. So he basically says that all systems are complex, and it's related to the amount of organized information, holding the system together. And that when you add more information into that organized information, you make the system more complex. The interactions of the components and their interfaces, that's where the complicatedness is. So more components, more interfaces, that makes it more complicated. I think that we as engineers, we can achieve the organized information of the whole, and our job is to realize the desired complexity, but to make it as less complicated as possible and more effective and more efficient. So he also relates efficiency and effectiveness to these things as well. So I do think Stony is worth looking at.
I would like to add to your thoughts. It was a great example you mentioned, right? Now, so our systems are complex, but when we think about the different disciplines, and we need all those disciplines, but they're very deep dive knowledge. So they look at the system, and it makes very complex. But when they look from their discipline on a very focused part of the system, for them it's not complex, complicated things. So that means we as systems engineer has to combine all those complicated views on the system and help them that they understand the system not as complex and not as complicated.
Thank you.
We're right at our time, so I'm sorry we don't have time for the last question because I want to
Okay.
acknowledge
Alex.
the work that our panelists, particularly before you say thank you, I just want to give them a small gift because the foundations, the fundamentals of systems engineering is a tough nut to crack. So I've got them some Hawaiian kukui nuts. Ollie, I want to give Thank you so much. Very much. And Lydia, thank you. And JD, come on up. Thank you. Okay, now you can put your hands together for the panel. All right, I think lunch is ready, so appreciate it. And if you have more questions, come on up and I'm sure the panels would love to chat.